So we are talking now about innovation in skills and workforce, so kind of how do governments and civil services really make sure that their workforces have the skills that they need to be these innovative forces for change and to embrace all of the new technologies that we've been talking about. And I'm delighted to have with us here today, so we have Thomas Beautyman, who's Deputy Director at the Government Digital, for Government Digital Capability, sitting in the Cabinet Office here in the UK. And then we have Ryan Acosta, who is the Commissioner for the Civil Service Commission all the way from the Philippines. Lovely to have you with us here, Ryan. We have John Park, who is Head of Government Affairs and Public Policy at Google Cloud, one of our knowledge partners. And then you've heard from Ping Soon this morning. I'm delighted to have you back, Ping Soon, Chief Executive Officer from the Government Technology Agency in Singapore. And then we also have Debbie Adler, who's Director General for People, Capability and Place at the Department for Work and Pensions here in the United Kingdom. So, Thomas, over to you for some opening thoughts.
3,863 vacancies. That was the number I shared with this forum a year ago. Today, that number is now 4,123 digital maker vacancies that we have across the civil service. That's a gap. That's a gap of cloud engineers that we need to make sure when we agree a pay offer with probation officers and with barristers, we don't have to recode 5 different systems to make that work. That's a gap in our workforce of accessibility specialists and user researchers that we need to make sure that we are hearing those seldom heard voices and building the skills, the systems that can genuinely serve some of those most marginalised communities that come to government for help. So we have a gap in terms of the digital makers that government needs in the UK. We also have a gap when we look beyond the digital makers, when we look into the wider workforce. And like many organisations, I think we're reflecting in the civil service that the skills we need to deliver modern government are changing. More than 50% of our people tell us they don't feel confident that they've got the skills that they need to deliver in future. So what does that mean for us? Well, I would suggest there's 2 critical imperatives. For all of those in the room that have agency and are decision makers and can go and advocate, firstly, there is a choice. There's a choice and a need to prioritise, to genuinely make addressing some of these challenges a priority now. And the second imperative is actually we look inward and we make sure that if everybody understands it's their role as a manager and leader in the civil service in government in the UK to grow those skills from within. It's not for HR, it's not for a cross-government forum, it's actually all of our job to develop the skills that we need in future. So I thought I'd leave with just three thoughts as to, I suppose, my appeal to this audience. That the first thing is, like any good change programme, we need to tell the story. Why? Why is this an issue? Why is it important? And we need to back that up with measuring ourselves and testing how we're going to do that. And I work in a team called the Central Digital Data Office in Cabinet Office. Never before do we have the richness of our workforce insight that we now have, and we can see how we're progressing. The second bit of advice I would give this group, and maybe takeaway, is to make sure that we can role model to others. One of the things that we've done across the course of the last year is we've brought together a group of permanent secretaries across the civil service that meet every 2 months now to talk digital skills. And they increasingly are role modelling to others the change that we need to make to our workforce. And then the final appeal is we need to make sure our most senior leaders are equipped. And one of the things we did in Cabinet Office last year was set a new standard for the skills and the confidence that we expect all senior civil servants to have in future. A digital mindset, being data literate, being able to think with a user-first mindset. If you don't see your leaders, if you're not looking across your colleagues and seeing from your SCS community those behaviours, please encourage them to do so, because it's a critical imperative for us to make sure those leaders are able to role model from the front. Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you, Thomas. So really quite startling figures in terms of the kind of gaps that we have in terms of digital specialists that we need to recruit, But as you say, either bringing in from externally, but also how do you grow internally and train up people who are already in the civil service? Why is it important for delivering modern services, as you said? And also quite telling that 50%, more than 50% of people say they don't have the skills that they need to deliver kind of a modern civil service. And then I'd be interested if people will take up the challenge of challenging your own permanent secretaries and your senior leaders if you don't think they are role modelling some of those skills and behaviours that you would like them to see. Thank you so much, Thomas. Ryan, over to you to hear from the Philippines.
Yeah, thank you. I'll be speaking about the Philippine experience on this topic. But first, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Actually, the Philippines is embarking on a transformational journey pursuant to its ambition natin 2040, or our 2040 ambition. This ambition is a collective long-term vision and aspirations of the Filipino people for themselves and for the country in achieving a stable, a safe and secure life for every Filipino. The office that I work for, the Civil Service Commission, or the CSC, is the central human resource agency of the whole bureaucracy. So in support of the Ambition Natin 2040 initiative, we took on the mammoth task of transforming our 123-year-old bureaucracy into institutions that are smart, with future-ready workforce capable of serving the ever-growing population of the Philippines, which right now stands at more than 109 million. And because of the limited human resource personnel of the government, without any expectation that it will increase proportionately with the population, the bureaucracy really has no choice but to embrace change, innovation, and creativity. If there's one silver lining in the COVID-19 pandemic, at least in the experience of the Philippines, it is that it catalyzed or expedited the implementation of several digital transformation initiatives. Nonetheless, we are still a long way from our desired state. In fact, from the needs assessment and the digital maturity assessment we've conducted last year, the CSC, together with 7 other public sector institutions, were put at the midpoint of the transition level, the third in the 5 stages of digital transformation, where we found out that we still need to develop capacity and capability, especially in people, culture, and technology. From these assessments, we are now mapping out the transformation journey through what we dub as EPIC plan, where E stands for educate leadership, P stands for promoting engagement and involvement and connectivity, I stands for improvement in digital competency, and finally C for creating technology-enabled platforms. As I've said, we have a long way to cover, but as I think at this stage of our journey, we do have some lessons that some organizations may want to consider in their own digital transformation journey. Number one, I think that I can think of is starting small and simple. In fact, our online courses at the Civil Service Institute started by just encouraging the course administrators to try out the different online applications. In 2 years, we were able to triple the number of governments trained using that framework. Number 2 is to prioritize initiatives that have relatively high level of success, because enhancing the confidence of your workforce is very critical, and encourage them to pursue bigger challenges. Number 3 is to nurture a culture of openness to creative and innovations. Number 4, I think, is to leverage on the experiences and best practices of your networks, because we don't have to learn everything the hard way. We are very thankful for our local agencies and counterparts at the ASEAN and several other countries which help us by giving us resources and sharing their experiences, which is very important. And finally, I've heard this from one speaker earlier, just to keep moving forward. Even the more advanced or the most advanced agencies we've benchmarked with admitted that failure is a necessary part of the process. So what's important is to keep moving, to just keep focusing on the goal. Thank you very much for the opportunity to share insights from the Philippines, and most importantly, to hear from speakers from other countries whose transformations are far more advanced than ours.
Thank you so much. I mean, I love the fact that you've called it the EPIC plan, because it really encapsulates the scale of the ambition that you have for your citizens, over 109 million citizens, so no small task there. And really nice that you've already got lessons to share with people, so learning. So start small and simple, prioritise success so that others can see that success, nurture an open culture, and as we've heard in other sessions, really leverage your networks. Don't create things yourself if other people have already done that. Thank you so much, Ryan, for that perspective. John, over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan, and it's a great pleasure to be here today and have the opportunity to represent Google, and to hear a lot of the conversations that have been happening this morning have made me very optimistic about the potential that is in this room and the desire to work with each other to take change forward. And in that spirit, we did some work with the Global Government Forum and the Cabinet Office towards the end of last year, trying to understand where the skills needs were and where the opportunities were across government, to try and help government, but also to help us better understand and inform the debate around skills development, particularly in the context of digital transformation. And we, as you would expect, we found some interesting points of feedback, but we also got some really positive points of feedback as well. You know, as you can imagine, you know, lots of people think that digital transformation could be held back by technology, legacy technology in particular. You'll find also that there is disparities between departments where people feel they have access to gaining skills and digital skills, but others may not, and may feel that if they did, you know, they would be able to deliver services much better in the way that they can at the moment. But what I found really interesting and what made me very optimistic about it was that over 85% of all civil servants see it in their role to innovate. Whatever that innovation looks like, they believe that is something we should be doing. And again, that is something to highlight how much potential there is there. And also 76% of that 86% believe that technology is part of unlocking that innovation. So again, a very positive result. But there are challenges there, so what do we have to do about that? I think from a Google perspective, our view is very much about trying to work in partnership with government. I think that should be something that, you know, all the private sector and the public sector should aspire to. We think that's key to unlocking innovation, but we also think that's key to unlocking innovation in skills, whether that's how you access skills, whether that's how you develop them yourself, whether that's how you learn. So I think that is, again, an area we should think about. And we know that from some of the work that we've done with the departments. We've been working with DFT and working with ONS on you know, how we build capacity and help them develop skills on some of the joint projects that we're working on. So that's what happens at a very direct level. But I think that we all have that broader responsibility to ensure that the public sector is a place where it can attract talent and develop skills. So we're thinking very carefully about how we do that. And that's not just about in the public sector, but it's about the broader economy as well. I think it was raised this morning in the first session about how we have more fluidity between the public and private sectors, and that's something I would definitely agree with. More fluidity between governments, more fluidity in the UK as well, because we're a changing country. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. And what we do in Google at the moment to try and create that culture of learning and develop these opportunities is run a lot of our own programmes which try to reach as far as they can into communities. So we have Digital Garage, which has been running since 2015, has nearly had over 900,000 people access free training to help them gather skills. skills about, you know, going online or just taking your first steps, or skills that help you build your business or build your career in a different direction. And, you know, the more we see that happening, the more we see results, and we see that as a responsibility to continue with programmes like that. But more specifically as well, and I think this is really relevant to what we've been talking about here today, is how do we harness existing programmes that are out there, particularly apprenticeship programmes, I would say, which are well placed to upskill and develop people and give them opportunities to have those qualifications which will help them in their job that they're in at the moment, but also will help them to go into the future opportunities that they may have. And I think it's, you know, if we were talking about making sure that people can have public and private and voluntary sector experience indeed, you know, looking at how we use apprenticeships, looking at how we utilise existing frameworks we have in place, I think would be a really good first start. And the final thing I want to close on, we've been really focused on how we make technology more accessible. We opened our first accessibility discovery centre outside North America just at the end of last year. And that is looking at, in an agnostic way, across all technology, how that becomes more accessible, how we develop that. So no matter what your background is, that you can access technology and you could, you know, use it in your day-to-day life or use it in your career to move forward. So it's great to have the opportunity to be part of this panel today, and I look forward to the questions from the audience.
Thank you, John. Really interesting for anyone that was in the inclusion session before lunch. One of the things that came up there is we need more learning and development people in the room when we're talking about inclusion. So interesting to hear what you said about the accessibility work that you've been doing, but also just interesting what you said there about the partnership working between private and public sector being increasingly important and increasingly normal, how we can learn from each other. And one question I think which I'll be interested to hear from the speakers and the audience, you said about attracting talent. How do you attract great digital professionals, for example, into the public sector when they can get paid a lot more in the private sector? I think that's still a big challenge. Thank you so much, John. Ping Soon, over to you.
Thank you, Siobhan. It's good to be back in the panel. I'm working very hard for this conference. I'd like to structure my remarks in three parts to answer three questions. One, what is the operating context for the public service in the future? And of course, I was speaking more in the context of Singapore. Set against that operating context, the second question is, what is the future for public service delivery? Again, at least in Singapore context. And then the third, to thrive in such a public service to deliver that kind of services, what is needed in terms of skills and the workforce? So, let me start by talking about the operating context for Singapore. I don't know about it in the UK, but we are facing three key constraints in Singapore. First constraint is labor. The short of it, we are just not reproducing ourselves enough. Our total fertility rate is a miserable 1.1, and in 2030, 1 in 4 Singaporeans will be above the age of 65. I'm not included in that. And the reality is, of course, we can do immigration, but there's only so much we can do immigration without reducing the Singaporean identity and the Singaporean core. So that's the first constraint we face. The second constraint we face is fiscal. Yes, the Singapore government has been known to be quite rich. We generate surpluses, but guess what? A lot of the surpluses and reserves that we have generated over the last 20 years is all used and spent to deal with COVID over the last 3 years. And together with the fact that the economy is more mature and greater uncertainty in the global environment, we do have to be more prudent in terms of the overall fiscal spending to deal with a mature economy and an aging population. And the third constraint that the Singapore government is facing is carbon. Many of you all would know Singapore is just 1 degree north of the equator, so we are located in the tropics, low-lying, and we are very vulnerable to changes in the climate. But as a government, we are committed to achieve net zero by 2050, and for the public sector to achieve that in 5 years before, by 2045. So that's the three operating contexts that the Singapore Public Service has to operate in. Then what is the future for public service delivery in Singapore? Three things. I think Singapore public service delivery has to be leaner. We've got to do more with less, given the resource constraint. Number two, we would like public service delivery in Singapore to be of better quality, right? And better quality means to be able to provide services that are more personalized, more anticipatory. There was a panel before lunch, and I really liked some of the speakers saying that it's not about digital only, but it's about digital first. And we can do that, right, because the population is getting to be more literate. So we want to offer better services because that's what citizens are expecting. You can order something from shopping cart and you know exactly where the goods are before it reach your front door. Why should that not be expected of government services? And the third aspect of public service delivery in Singapore is we want to be able to do it in a more technology-enabled way. As I mentioned, technology is a great opportunity for us to exploit in order for us to be leaner and for us to provide better services. And we can do that not just because technology is there, but because generally the population is more digitally literate. And we are investing heavily in the technology infrastructure. We have 5G coverage in the whole of Singapore, for example. So if that is the sort of public service delivery, one that is leaner, that provides better services and technology-enabled, then what ought to be the face of public service and the workforce? So 3 things come to mind. When you think about, and you're kind of familiar with this literature, right? When you assess a person, you will be looking for the IQ of the person. In the past, we talked about the EQ. So I'll posit that there are 3 more Qs that we need in the workforce. The first is what I call AQ, the agility quotient. For those of you all who were in the morning in the panel, I spoke about the need to be more agile. I spoke about the need of public servants to understand what goes on in the design thinking framework, to be able to empathize, to define, to ideate, to prototype, and to scale. And each of these steps require you to understand better methodologies, and how do you do that? So I think as an individual in the public service, you need to be more agile. And correspondingly, a public service needs to be more agile. How do you organize teams, multidisciplinary, more open, more ready for experimentation? The second Q, I think some of my panel members have talked about, is DQ, right? What is the digital quotient? I think the public servants of tomorrow can no longer just be PowerPoint warriors, or familiar with Word, with Excel worksheet. You need to be experts of even Tableau, right? To be able to manipulate the data yourself, to do the storytelling and do visualization. It should be a requirement that permanent secretaries should not be asking for charts to be on PowerPoint slides to be presented. A permanent secretary should be able to operate Tableau, self-help, and manipulate the dashboard and get answers for themselves. A future civil servant should be not just using Microsoft Outlook and Mail for collaboration. They should be able to use MS Teams. They should be able to use Jira, should use Confluence, and all these collaboration tools. We don't expect public servants to be able to code in programming language, but should they not know how to use simple RPA tools like UiPath to do simple robotic process automation to simplify manual tasks? I think that ought to be a requirement for future public officers. Or even learn some of the low-code systems, whether it's Pega, OutSystems, to do simple programming, do workflow in order to turn out some of these services in a much faster rate to serve the citizens. So I think that's another important skills that public officers need to have. And finally, the last Q that I would posit is LQ, right? The learnability quotient. Against the 3 operating contexts that I mentioned, I think there's 3 certainties. I think one thing we can be certain is that the world will be more uncertain, that the world will be more complex, and the world will be increasingly face more and more disruption. And set against that, it just means that, you can't imagine that 15 years or 16 years of education can prepare somebody for the next 50 years. It's just not possible. So we all have to learn and relearn at a much faster pace. And the line between what happened in school and what happened at work has to be blurred. We need to reach a state where it is a work-learn kind of environment rather than school and kind of work. So that's my suggestion to think about, not IQ, not just EQ, but AQ, DQ, and LQ.
Thank you so much. So envisaging that future where you have public service delivery that's efficient, that's increasingly personalised, that's technology-enabled, then you're saying the workforce that we need is going to have to be more agile, they're going to have to be more literate in digital and data, and they're going to have to be open to continually learning throughout their careers. Thank you so much, Ping Sung. Debbie, over to you.
So last up, how do I follow this? In our pre-meet, we talked about what we might share, and so I thought I might focus for a moment on our customers, on claimants, on citizens, alongside people who work for the civil service. So 3 quick points, hopefully from me. The first is, as we run our organisations, and I am on the executive team of the Department of Work and Pensions here in the UK. We're the largest government department with just shy of 90,000 employees. As we run that organisation, we need to think about policy outcome delivery. We need to think about efficiency, and we need to think about citizen customer experience. We are serving the government of the day, we are serving the taxpayer, and we are serving those citizens who need our services, particularly for us, at the most vulnerable points in their lives. And innovation, use of data, digital tooling are ways that allow you to address all three of those objectives. My second point was just to give you a quick bit of practical insight to some of the work we've done in DWP. So I think there's a couple of slides, hopefully, that might ping up. Let's see if anything happens. One more. Thank you very much. That looks tiny here, but it's enormous up there. This just gives you a quick snapshot. I'm delighted to say that we're only apparently 30% gap in digital confidence, as opposed to the 50% that Thomas has talked about. But basically, this just shows you some of the basic work we've been doing around digital confidence and seeing the efficacy of that confidence after 3 months applied in the workplace, translating into a more efficient organisation, translating into the confidence of those individuals. The second slide, these are quick snapshots, but the second slide, if you move on, thank you, is some of the products that we've been using, the frameworks that we've been using. We've partnered with Lloyds Banking Digital Index as a way of understanding our own maturity around digital skills. We work with the Government Digital and Data Office on the learning provision to support that. And importantly, that's learning for digital specialists all the way through to individuals who need that as part of, but they're not digital specialists in our organisations. So there's quite a lot of information there, but in essence, it's about having a framework allowing people to self-assess, having easy access to point-in-time learning, whether that's visual, audio, face-to-face learning in componentized blocks that allow people to draw down at point of need. And then my final point really is coming back to the citizen. So we are seeing a correlation, and we're testing this, we're mining this data, between the digital confidence of frontline civil servants and the policy outcomes we are seeking to achieve. The more confident people are in job centres as work coaches, that is translating into confidence to coach claimants, to get their CVs online, to do the online job search, to use the apps to search and connect with the world of work. So this golden thread that I started with about policy outcomes, efficiency, and customer experience, there's a fantastic line of sight between equipping our own people who work as civil servants, hugely driven by public value, in turn improving the digital confidence in the wider economy. And I think there's a fantastic opportunity that this becomes a virtuous circle. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dorisa. I think the message coming out really strongly from there is, as your digital confidence increases, ultimately you get better outcomes for citizens, which I think is what we've all been kind of saying and moving towards. But interesting, you also mentioned partnerships with private sector organisations, and then I think what we'll throw it over to the audience with is you talked about different types of learning, different types of upskilling, so whether that's face-to-face, and you were mentioning online and digital opportunities, all of those being important and all of those choices for our workforces. Thank you so much for those opening remarks. We have got at least 15 minutes for questions, so I'm going to throw it over to the audience. We've got a question down here and then a question here. So I'll take those two first and then I'll come to you for the next one. So can we have 2 mics down the front? Thank you. We've got a gentleman second row back and another gentleman here in the second row from the front. Thank you.
Sorry, my name's Armand. I'm a user researcher in the digital and technology and design sphere. On an individual level, a person's career prospects will likely increase with their skills. So my question concerns the possibility of brain drain from city to city, but also country to country. I'm speaking myself as someone who's emigrated from the Philippines for my parents' perceived increased opportunity here in the UK. But also, as you mentioned, from public sector to private sector, how can we mitigate the loss of skilled workers in the environment that fostered them, and how might increasing ease of remote working impact on this as well?
Thank you. So the question about retention. So once you skill people up, how do you retain them? So either how do you retain them in the public sector, or how do you retain them in a particular country where they've been upskilled? Thank you. And we had another question here. Sorry, here.
Hi, thank you. I'm afraid mine is similar to on the point of retention. My name's Jonathan Nunn, and I work at HMRC, but my civil service journey began like 7 years ago when I became part of the digital data and technology fast stream, and that's kind of where the question comes from. I don't want it to be seen as a reflection on my current employer. But my question is, like, how do we retain people, and how do we create a right environment where we can retain them? From, starting 7 years ago, I've worked with a lot of really talented people, and a lot of them have left the civil service now. These are people that could have taken graduate jobs elsewhere. They chose public service. And we've talked about money today on the panel, but nearly every time I talk to people, it's not about money, it's about the environment, it's about management, it's about leadership. And invariably, it was the frustration with those in that environment that caused people to leave. You had managers that just didn't know what the people they were leading actually did. I had a manager that thought, because I did digital, I could do graphic design. And I can't, I'm terrible at drawing. But my point is, how do we not just upskill the people with the technical skills, but how do we upskill the people so that they can manage them correctly, and how do we lead them? There's someone that made a point earlier on about how do we do the boring properly.
Thank you.
And I think
so
that's it.
I like the way you phrased that at the end there. So it's also a question about retention, but how do you upskill people, not just in technology, but how do you upskill managers as well to make sure that they are making sure that we keep the talent in the civil service? And I think there was also an issue of, does hybrid working help in terms of retaining people? Who would like to go first on this one? Debbie, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you. So thank you for both of those questions. So a couple of thoughts, and I'm sure colleagues will want to add to this. One of the ways we organise ourselves in our digital group in my department is we have leaders of the communities of practice, and then leaders who, if you like, are doing performance and task management. And I think that enables both a real deep understanding of the job family, the development of the individual in a particular job family within digital. So that community of practice leader, I think, is tremendously important for individual development. By having a separate, if you like, performance and task manager, that's somebody who's probably going to have more of that experience about leading the team, how you get the best out of people, how you set stretched objectives, how you create collaborative working ethos. And that's certainly one of the ways we've tackled, if you like, the challenge of leading specialists. I think it is quite hard to do the whole EQ, IQ, AQ, DQ, and LQ.
All the Qs.
All the Qs in one person, right? Secondly, I was going to say about remote working and talent drain. There is a tension here, but I think there is also an opportunity. More and more employers, particularly for digital skills, are saying work anywhere. And I think the ability to tap into markets to say you don't have to uproot your family, but actually we want to bridge and find a way of connecting with talent around the world, I think is particularly acute in digital. And we should be embracing that, and that goes to kind of different ways of connecting up, different ways of working. And my final point, there is fluidity in and out is great. I'm not sure I want to be in a civil service where everyone's done 40 years service. It's great, some people will. I think we've even got some people doing 70 years service in DWP, but you need some movement in and out, and I think kind of that healthy movement is something to embrace.
Thank you. Peng Soon, do you have an issue of a retention problem?
Big problem.
Do you?
Big problem. But let me just make 3 points here. I think, am I okay for losing people out of the public service? I'm quite chill about it. I think the value proposition increasingly for the public service, at least in Singapore, the tagline is that we are not offering you lifetime employment, but we are trying to make you lifetime employability. So the idea is changing away from lifetime employment to lifetime employability. And so the public service is taking on the responsibility not to guarantee you a job, but to make sure that you're employable. So what does that mean? That means that we have to find opportunities to provide you the skills training for you to upgrade. And so the second point that I want to make is that in order to encourage your leaders, middle managers to upskills, the entire civil service need to move away from a very seniority-based kind of system into one that's competency-based. And Singapore Public Service is taking that first step. We're not starting with all the different functions. We're starting with the ICT first, because in the ICT field, it's something that can be measured quite objectively. So the idea as a competency workforce is to translate all these very complex job roles that you have into a certain set of competencies and job roles. So the whole of GovTech, for example, right, we are all organized into 10 different functional clusters and about 32 job roles. So we are placing our officers into each of these job roles, and they're assessed on their competencies from level 1 to level 5. For fresh graduates that come into GovTech, I don't really care whether they are a graduate student, a degree, or poly students. They go through an assessment. And if they pass the technical assessment, they can code. If they're cybersecurity, they show well and they capture the flag, they get employed. And I don't make differentiation in salary depending on your degree. So once they come in, they are placed, and then it is their job to get elevated increasingly based on competency. So competency is now a factor, not just for recruitment. It is a factor to consider for promotion. It's a factor for consider whether you get placed in a different job. So the civil service need to move increasingly to competency-based. And once you're competency-based, your managers better upskill themselves if the job requires you to learn certain things. So the second thing that I want to mention. The third one, do I still lose sleep about retaining people? I do. But I think just what the gentleman was saying, as the saying goes, right, most people join the organization but leave because of the people. So I think increasingly as an organization, we need to focus on 3 things. And one is, of course, the purpose. And I think that is something that we all have an advantage. Yeah, what more noble cause is there for you to wake up every day trying to make lives better for your fellow citizens? But just focusing on purpose is just not enough. I mentioned in the morning panel, government is full of bureaucracy. So what can you do to allow the autonomy that the software engineers, software developers actually work on software delivery and not writing policy papers and procurement papers and what have you? So find an environment that you can allow them to operate more autonomously. And the final point I want to make, which is linked to competency, you've got to create an environment where the competent officers are having the opportunity to keep deepening their mastery. The last you want is for the public service to be a place where you get de-skilled, right? It's a place that you actually drop in value because you are de-skilled. So how do you create that environment for them to continue to deepen their mastery? Key questions to answer as you think about retaining your talent.
Thank you. I'm really conscious we've got other questions. Well, that was a popular answer. I'm conscious we've got lots of other questions, but Ryan, did you want to say anything on kind of possible brain drain in particular?
Yeah, because I think the Philippines has a unique experience when it comes to retention. Number one, we do have the service obligation contract that if the training or seminar is for several months, it depends on the length of the training, you are obligated to render service to the government. So you cannot just break that contract unless you want to repay the expenses. But that's not sustainable. I think we really have to train our leaders to be people-centric. That's one of the skills that we are trying to ingrain in our leaders. And finally, there's also a factor of what COVID-19 showed us before. During the peak of the COVID-19, workers have their jobs under threat, so it was an envy for them to get employment in the government. So that's one factor going good for us, but again, that's not sustainable. If leadership intervention, job security, and service obligation is not enough, we take comfort in the fact that whether they are in the public or private sector, if they are very good performers and productive members of the society, all their contributions will redound to the country.
Great, so it's not lost, none of the training is lost. Thank you. John, Thomas, unless you have a burning desire, I'm going to put the next question to both of you first. So we'll take 2 more questions. I'm conscious, does anybody have a question in the higher levels? No. So, okay, we've got two down here. We've got a lady at the front and then just a couple of rows back as well. If we've got time, I'll come back. And then there's another one just behind after. Okay, thanks.
Hiya, so I'm Lizzie, I work for DWP. I wanted to ask, sort of along the lines of retention, but how do we, or how do other governments streamline recruitment processes, make them a little bit faster, make them a little bit more sort of sufficient, and sort of retaining that talent from within then? Is there a way of streamlining that process for people that are internal to be able to access the opportunities, say in digital, for example, to be able to move between quite easily in comparison to if we came in externally?
Great. So how do you speed up recruitment processes and make it easier for people to move around within the service and maybe moving from a non-technical role to a technical role, for example? Thank you. And then...
Hi, Sarah Hammond. So I work in procurement for Army Headquarters. And one of the things is you're talking about upskilling people in the digital environment. But what we find is that actually the systems are slowing us down as well. So I collaborate across defence, but working with Home Office, the police, or even the frontline commands and DSTL, we're all on different systems. So trying to collaborate, trying to work together on teams, not having a shared workspace we can work on. We're all working off systems that are working against each other, and then when you move from one department to another, you have to learn a whole new system on top of finance and procurement systems and safety systems and everything else.
Yeah.
So is there a way, well, just in defence, let alone across government, that we can look at the entire network to make our systems easier to use, and then we can upskill people in those specialist areas?
Thank you. So the question about one of the barriers, I think, to training across when you're working, you're in defence, but you work with police, you work with other organisations, and all your systems are different. So how do you kind of overcome some of those historic infrastructure issues as well about this? So Thomas, I'm going to come to you, and then John, your thoughts on both or one of those.
So right now there are something like about 300,000 software developer vacancies in the UK. There's not enough capacity in the UK workforce to serve our needs with the digital skills that we need. And like many organisations, I think this is a bit of a wake-up point for the civil service, and it places real emphasis and a real need for us to genuinely develop from within, to find ways to go and uncover actually all of those talented individuals that might be working in a visa processing centre somewhere in the Home Office, or as a work coach somewhere in DWP, and identify actually where might the potential exist in those communities and give them the opportunity to upskill into potentially digital roles, into service transformation roles. When we look at the kind of skills that make for really, really impactful people working in the digital environment, it's not necessarily those really deep technical skills like DevOps, site reliability, engineers. Yes, those skills are important, but 80% of the skills that we see in those individuals are the same skills that we see in high-performing civil servants across the board. They're able to think critically, they're able to work as a team, they're able to really work through different problems. So to the point about recruitment, absolutely, our recruitment processes need to be better. The vacancy holder experience, the candidate experience is not good enough, and there are multiple activities across different departments that are in place to improve that process. In parallel, however, there is also a need, and there's a number of initiatives that we can speak to that actually will start to create much greater opportunity for people within our government organisation to find pathways into different kind of roles, including digital data.
Thank you. And I'm looking at the time, so John, this will be the last comments from you on recruitment and systems.
Yeah. I think it is a really, really good point. I think I talk about what we do in Google, but also to say that you're not alone in outside we have you know, a cluttered landscape when it comes to skills and opportunities there. It's not something that's unique to the civil service, but there's 2 or 3 things that we do in Google which I think work quite well to try and give people those opportunities. You could have 20% extra time working on a particular project. You do something that's called a bungee, which is our way of saying that you go in a work placement for a period of time in a different department, which obviously works quite well and gives people experience. But I also think, and we've spoken to some commercial organisations, or we do this with some commercial organisations, and we're speaking to some parts of the public sector about that, is how you then build partnerships between private and public sector organisations so you could get that sharing of opportunity and give someone a different perspective. Ultimately, it needs leadership, and it needs a culture which accepts that approach. And it's really about developing leadership and management to make sure that it's something that's seen as a benefit rather than a cost to give people time away or different opportunities if you have to backfill someone or recruit. And yeah, I think it's not a unique problem that you have. It's certainly one that every business faces, every part of the public sector faces, and we'll have to deal with it.
Thank you so much. I'm really sorry we are out of time, and I know there were lots of other questions.